Have you ever heard about oxygen cake? Oxygen cake? Neither have I. But today we're going to find out because we're going way back, like vintage way back to the early 1900s to figure out what the hell is oxygen cake. I'm Diver Dave. We're still in the dive lab. I've got some vintage coffee today. Stay tuned. Welcome back, and let's get into vintage diving. And the background here is there's always a few mornings in a week where I'm enjoying a coffee, and I come across a photo that really piques my interest in terms of diving history. And this photo that I'm going to share next really sort of got my curiosity going, and then we went down the deep rabbit hole. Well, actually not that deep because they could only go to 25, 30 feet. I just saw the photo and I was like, I needed to understand what the hell is going on here. Like, we have what appears to be a bunch of divers wearing, at least this day and age, we would think that looks like minions. And you could almost understand where the minion design came from looking at this photo. We actually have to go back even further to the mid-1800s to talk about the open water dive dress setup. And we have a picture up here on the screen. As you can see, it's probably a diver taking a break on the bank. And these setups were mainly used for exploration in the rivers. It would have been diamond exploration, you name it. It was surface fed from a pump with a big wheel that you can see in the photo on the left. And I'm going to assume that the relationship between the person spinning the pump and the diver was probably pretty important. The way this worked was, it was an open water dress, which means it did fill up with water. But of course, the compressed air coming in from the top kept the water level under control inside the suit. No doubt you wanted to make sure that the water level never got above the mouth. Really, really crazy now that you think about it in terms of the equipment that we're using. Now we fast forward to the early 1900s and we have submarines and we have war and we have submarine warfare going on, of course, where the Royal Navy in England decided, hey, it's probably time to take a look at building a diving escape suit for our submariners in case the submarine got flooded. I don't even understand how this would work because depending on what depth the submarine was at, let's just put that aside for a second. And so they commissioned the Sieb Gorman and Limited Company to start looking and investigating in terms of what a suit design could look like. And in 1904, their managing director, Sir Robert Henry Davis, decided that he would be the one to design the first practical version of a self-contained breathing apparatus. In 1904, they came out with their first design because they were trying to sell it to the Royal Navy, and it consisted again of an open water dress design, which means it did fill up with water, but it had tubes in it that you could breathe from and a small cylinder outside that had compressed air where you could actually feed it into the top of the hood to keep the water level under control. But it does say in the notes here that even if the water went above the mouth because you were breathing from the tube, you would be okay, but you had to use the nose clip. I mean, just think about this. Think about the testing that this would have gone through and how sketchy it would have been compared to today's standards. But I guess if choice number one is hang out on the submarine that's sinking and filling up with water, and choice number two is rock the minion suit, f it, my money's on the minion suit all day long. All right, so back to the 1904 design. No shocker, it did not sell to the Royal Navy. They just weren't interested, so they had to go back to the drawing board and make some changes. At the same time as they were working to improve the design of the self-contained diving apparatus, there was a chemist named George Schaubert who invented a way of chemically producing oxygen through the use of sodium and potassium peroxides. And even better, the alkaline byproduct could actually absorb CO2. This, to me, sounds like the beginnings of a rebreather. So can you imagine that 1904, I'm still learning how to dive my rebreather behind me, and it's, what, 2025? 1904, they were literally starting to use this type of basic technology. And the way it worked was the sodium and potassium peroxide was a solid block that when exposed to moist air would off-gas oxygen and of course have the alkaline byproduct. This was a pretty cool invention, and its name was Oxylithe or Oxylithe, with a nickname called oxygen cake. Finally, we get to the oxygen cake piece of the story. But here's the downside. The peroxide combination made it extremely unstable and had a tendency to self-ignite when exposed to too much water. So here we are potentially starting to think about using this in a self-contained diving apparatus suit that actually fills up with water, or I have an issue with the rebreathing piece of this. Now I'm going to have to worry about not just the nose clip, not just about the hood filling up, but I also might have a tendency to self-ignite. That is not a cool look for any diver. Nevertheless, after hearing about the ability to chemically produce oxygen, the Sieb Gorman and Company Limited jumped at the chance to buy the rights to the technology so that they could incorporate it in their next revision of their self-contained diving apparatus escape suit. And in 1908, the Hall-Rees Independent Breathing Apparatus was born, and after extensive trials with the Royal Navy, they decided to kit every one of their submarines, which were 47 at the time, with the new technology. That's pretty cool. But they didn't stop there. They also marketed the design in fire protection services as a smoke helmet, and as well as a shallow water diving apparatus. I want to walk through a scenario because you have a submarine that's sinking, filling up with water, and I'm going to assume you have a ton of sailors inside the submarine that are now scrambling around, trying to don their escape apparatus suits, their hoods, their mouthpieces. Hopefully the oxygen generator is working. And then at that point, what? They have to make their way to the conning tower and then hopefully pop out through the hatch and make it to the surface? Is that the plan? This would have been some really low odds on survival. And I guess if you look at it the other way, well, it's inevitable if you stay on the sub that bad things will happen. So you might as well just take a chance and pop on out the conning tower. I would love to understand what the testing was like on this. One of the things that I thought was really interesting on the website was they eventually changed the design from a soft hood into a hard helmet, which looked definitely more like a minion. And it was based out of aluminum or copper. And the rationale was based on the fact that if a sailor came out of the conning tower and had a rapid ascent, which I don't understand how not every one of them would be a rapid ascent. I mean, there's no way of controlling that. At least if you had impact with something at the surface, that the harder helmet would hopefully help and improve your chances of survival. I mean, we are talking about some crazy stuff here. There are days when I'm getting into my dive gear and I'm complaining a little bit about a back pain or this or that. I'm going to have to just keep myself in check and remember some of these stories, because compared to this, any of the stuff we have to deal with is insignificant. Let's take a moment to talk about the rebreather technology. It was hanging inside the suit on your chest. This sounds familiar. And it had two tubes. One was a shorter tube that was connected into the Oxylithe material, and that tube had a mouthpiece. And of course, as you breathe back and forth, you would generate and sort of activate the Oxylithe material to generate oxygen. And even that alone, if you think about for a moment, once you're inside this suit and your arms are kind of sealed, if you let that mouthpiece go, you can't actually get it back. There's no way to actually use your hands to put it back into your mouth. So that would have been a pretty critical piece of the training back then, I'm sure. The second tube was a bit longer, and it was the exhaust piece, the CO2 that would end up going into the top of the hood inside. And then, interestingly enough, somehow that exhaust would then get pulled back into your breaths and almost get kind of like double scrubbed. I don't quite exactly understand how that all worked, but I guess, again, 1904, it is what it is. And when you're faced with either staying on the submarine or rocking this suit, well, the choice is pretty simple. The challenge would have been storing these suits in the submarine because, of course, space would have been very critical. And not only that, but these tubes, the inhale, the exhale, would have had to have rubber stops to ensure that these boxes weren't prematurely activated so that when you really needed it, they were already exhausted. I could not actually find any data in terms of how many of these suits were used in action and in terms of the survival rates. So it's really unsure of how effective these were or would have been. But I do know in 1916, these suits were used in the first underwater movie, Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. And if you take a look on YouTube, you can actually find that entire movie up there, and it's pretty cool to watch. I know it's old, I know it's vintage, but to see these suits in use is actually pretty cool. Let's review what this diving setup would look like outside of the submarine usage. I'm a commercial diver or an underwater diver. Number one is the boots, 24 pounds. Number two is the helmet and the rebreather, that's 16 pounds, so I'm 40 pounds. Don't forget the weight belt. The weight belt, 65 pounds. So now I've got 105 pounds of lead just to get to the bottom. And what's the bottom? The max depth is 30 feet that they use these things because remember, they're breathing pure O2. So 20 to 30 feet was the operating range. And if everything is going okay, I'm at 20 to 30 feet, I still got to worry about the damn nose clip, and I got to worry about the frickin' mouthpiece, because if that comes out, I'm no longer breathing my oxygen. And on top of that, I have to maintain my balance with all this weight, because if I fall over, because it's an open-ended suit, now it fills up and I have a potential to drown. I mean, this, in comparison to anything that we have to put up with today, it's pretty incredible history. I hope you've enjoyed the session. I know I have. Practice hard, dive safe, and don't forget the nose clip. From a chemist named Georges, and he came up and he invented preparations, and he came up with a process that used sodium and potassium peroxides. Georges of essentially, who prevented? Who invented? George Schaubert. And when it was exposed, I'm struggling with this one. That's pretty good.